Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Berg. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. Please do not be alarmed when you see the episode length this edition, because as you know, I was recently just back in Australia, and one of the highlights of that trip, actually this is the reason for the trip, was moderating the main panel at the Australian Institute of International Affairs annual conference in Canberra. Now, this is the second time I've been invited to host this major panel of the conference. And to be honest, it is one of my favourites. And it's because the Institute's CEO, Bryce Wakefield, he puts a lot of effort into making sure that all these panellists are extremely varied, not just in their backgrounds, but in their strains of thinking on foreign policy in particular. And so it actually makes, as a moderator, it makes for a great discussion because I get to leap in and just simply tease out all these points of views, have them stacked against each other and see who can debate and argue their point perhaps more forcefully or more comprehensively or more persuasively. Anyway, it's all just super interesting. Now, this panel took place basically a couple of days after Trump was re-elected. And so this was a good stock take on what that election will mean for, of course, America's allies, America's foes, China policy, the Australia-US relationship, and much, much more. So you'll hear, and don't worry, you'll hear all the introductions as we go along, but you will hear from Australia's former Home Affairs boss and the author of the 2009 Defence White Paper, and also, by the way, a familiar voice to the long-time listeners of this podcast. Now, that's Mike Pezzullo. You're also going to hear from Professor Hugh White. He's one of the leading doves in Australia on China policy. Melissa Conley-Tyler, Director of the Asia-Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. That is way too many Ds, Melissa, I might just say. And Professor Peter Dean from the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. And he also wrote the Defence Strategic Review for Australia this year. So here's the first voice you're going to hear. He began the panel by giving his assessment of the result and why the Trump resurrection is not all doom and gloom, even if you're a never-Trumper.
What I thought I'd do as the US Studies representative was talk about the election itself and sort of tee the ball up, so to speak, for the panellists, and I can come back to some of the defence and foreign policy related questions later on. At the centre, we've kind of lived and breathed this election for the last, couple of years, but particularly the last few weeks. I want to start off with a couple of polling numbers. So 78% support for Harris and 22% support for Donald Trump. That is what the Lowy poll says Australians thought going into the election. So we know overwhelmingly who Australians preferred as their candidate for the US election, but of course we don't get a vote in US domestic politics. Another Lowy statistic I think is important to contextualise as we go into a second Trump administration. The Alliance, according to Lowy, when Trump was elected, had 80% public opinion support, and that had been pretty steady in the years leading up to 2016. It dropped 9 points after Donald Trump was elected. A year later, it rose by 7 points, and at the end of Trump's term in office, it was within a 1-point margin of error before it was where it started. So the Australian public had a very negative reaction initially, but by the end of that term, it had evened out, and we can talk a little bit later more what that might be about. I also wanted to start with the notion that this is a free, fair, and very smoothly run election. And I think democracy worked inside the United States. We may or may not agree with the outcome of that democracy, but democracy itself was a winner. And if you look, there was very little foreign interference, and the American electoral commissions and the state-based bodies have done a fantastic job in providing a surety around their democratic process. We got an overwhelming result. We now know that Trump won all the swing states and had a big electoral college lead. We know the Republicans, as we knew it was going to happen, were going to win the Senate. And while the House is still in doubt, the Democrats need to win twice as many of the remaining toss-up seats as the Republicans do to take a majority. So whoever gets a majority in the House will be very slim. Turnout was down on the last election, but early voting was considerably up, which also goes to show the faith the Americans have in their political system. It was not a vote for Trumpism. If you look at electoral exit polls, 75% of the the US electorate said they did not like either candidate, but when asked, they said they preferred Kamala Harris. Only 1/3 of Republicans identified themselves as MAGA supporters in exit polls. 2/3, though, thought the country under Biden was on the wrong track, and 75% of voters in the exit polls said that they thought Donald Trump would be better to achieve change because they thought the country was going in the wrong direction. And as it goes back to the good old Clinton analogy when he ran against Bush Sr., it's about the economy, stupid. This is definitely an economic factor and an economic win, and the American people voted for economic decisiveness, lower taxes, less regulation, lower corporate tax, lower personal tax, over political coherence and political cohesion, because we know we're not going to get the latter from Donald Trump, but they wanted the former. It was a cost of living election. Harris did not cover these issues or the desire for change in the electorate well enough, and she did not offset Trump's advantages with turnout in particular groups such as women and some racial groups to offset Trump's advantages in other areas. For Trump, it was he was the first Republican winner of the popular vote in a presidential election since George Bush in 2004. That is really significant. He won the popular vote. He increased his voter percentage amongst blacks, Hispanics, youth, labour unions and women, more so than any Republican candidate since 1964. So this tells you about something about the decisiveness of his victory and the broad-based appeal that he was able to achieve in that electorate. What do all those statistics tell us? It tells us that the US is not as progressive as Kamala Harris, but it's also not as reactionary as Donald Trump. Trump's coalition is broad-based and exceptionally fragile. It includes business leaders, traditional Republicans, MAGA supporters and independent voters, and a cross-coalition that identify of different racial groups and different genders. Congress, while the Republicans control the Senate has traditionally been more built around traditional or more conservative or Reaganist Republicans than MAGA Republicans. Congress also then potentially has majorities to protect. And that majority, the House and Senate leaders in the Republican Party know, comes from the middle and comes from the independents and not from the MAGA base. Now, Trump, we also know, is a lame duck. He cannot go for a third term constitutionally and legally. The 22nd Amendment protects that right, and if you want to change that amendment, on average it takes 7 to 8 years for US constitutional amendments to happen. You need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. You need 3/4 of the states, and you need 3/4 of the legislators in each of those states to vote in favour of it, and there's no way Democrats are going to support constitutional change that would allow Donald Trump to run again. We also know that incumbency at the moment for democratically elected governments is not good. Look at the New Zealand election, look at the French election, look at the Georgian election. Also look at the Japanese election, where the big hit the LDP took as well. And Justin Trudeau's up for election soon, and at the moment it seems to be, if you can't deal with the cost of living and inflation, it doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right, the voters will punish you for it. When it comes to where to from here, I think we've got to look at appointments in the Trump administration. So I'll just quickly sort of end on 2 points. Confirmable versus non-confirmable. If you've got to go to the Senate for confirmation, you're going to get more moderate people. If you're an appointed person in the White House, he can appoint whoever he wants. And how do we deal with this? I would lead with a baseball analogy. If Trump is the pitcher, you play one pitch at a time. Don't attempt to predict what that pitch is going to be. It could be a slider, could be a curveball, could be a fastball, could be inside the plate or outside the plate. You've got to wait until the pitch is thrown because you have no idea what pitch he's going to throw, absolutely none. And then you play that pitch on its merits. And I think that's as best as we can do to really predict what he's going to do in the next 4 years.
Okay, of all the sports, it's baseball. All right, we'll come back to that analogy, Peter. Next, we're going to hear from Melissa Conley-Tyler, who is the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. Melissa?
How does a faithful AUKUS, ANZUS, ally and a Quad pal dropped in a geopolitical hotspot in the Antipodean by Providence, a Liberal middle belt, Deal with a man consumed by choler. President 47, capricious, metricious. He's a climate change denier, an establishment pariah, tariff slapper-in-chief, mega hatter belief, 100 years of mateship doesn't bring much relief. And every day we watch him carrying the country away, strongman idle curious, alliances are spurious. And in 2024, they put him in charge. Welcome, folks, to the second Trump administration. Okay, now why did I start like that? Apart from the fact that I've always wanted to do it and you've helped me on my bucket list. For the Australians in the room, I'm confident that the vast majority of you, even with my delivery and my absolute lack of any musical talent, worked out that that was from Hamilton. Okay, so we watch the US all the time. The cultural products, the movies, the musicals. I studied and lived in the US for 2 years. I think reading blogs, podcasts, whatever, I suspect that most Australians are more likely to know the first president of the US than the first Prime Minister of Australia. I think we follow politics there at least as much as we do in our own. And I think now is a good time for us to break that particular habit. So when we had Trump 1.0, we could think of it as an aberration. You know, normality will be restored. And the Biden administration, I think, convinced those who wanted to be convinced that we could go back. But Trump 2.0 shows that those big trends, they are there for the long term. MAGA will remain because it's about the thinking, it's about the demographics. And we're going to see the sort of things we saw with Trump 1.0. We're going to have tariffs, different attitude to allies, withdrawal from Paris Climate Agreement. So in my head, there's now a whole lot of issues on which we're essentially going to count the US out of global discussions. Now, that is a real shame, and at least consciously I mean that. There's no sense of schadenfreude. I think we have existential risk, we have a challenging time, and we would love all countries to be coming together to work on it. But I think it's worth remembering, and both Zara and the Shadow Minister spoke about it at the start of the day, that we have actually done this before with a US that is not so engaged, that is not part of some of the global issues of the time. I'm not saying that I see Trump as isolationist as such. I think it's interest-driven, I think it's transactional, but in a way it amounts to a similar result, and certainly a disruptor, as you were saying. So Shadow Minister Birmingham this morning talked about the need to build networks in the region, to strengthen partnerships with all that share our interest. And I thought Heather put it very well, talking about like-minded countries working together in a networked grid, you know, a multi-partner world. And what that means for us is that we have to really concentrate, really have sustained attention on our region. And I'm going to say, if I look at the long sweep of Australian history, we have struggled to do so. The idea that we have to consistently use all tools of statecraft to engage the region, I think we know intellectually, but we're going to have to put it in practice. And that, I think, means seeing the world from their perspective, from the developing countries all around us. We may be agonising over the implications of a Trump presidency, but for the majority world of developing countries, they're just trying to get by. And I think they're probably not clear that any US president is that much in their interests. So while I wouldn't say it's the ideal impetus, I think this moment does present an opportunity for Australia to engage with the region. And I note that the Foreign Minister and Prime Minister, in their reaction to the Trump victory, talks about Australian agency and confidence. They say we should be confident in ourselves, in our place in the world, and the ability of Australians to work together to deliver on our interest as Australians. So my call to you is, don't spend the next 4 years glued to the 24-hour Trump show. The US may have the best tunes, but we do have to focus our attention elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa.
a very optimistic call. I think we're all going to be glued to the 24-hour Trump show. The next gentleman needs no introduction, really. Michael Pezzullo, former Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs.
Thank you, Latika. Can I just start with a slightly different, more historical perspective and tease out what is meant, or what we think is meant, by America First? It seems to be the received wisdom that Donald Trump running on an America First program is somehow exceptional. It is not. He is completely in the mainstream of American foreign policy. From the founding of the Republic in 1776 through to at least 1941, when America was dragged into World War II by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, this would have been a completely unexceptional understanding of American foreign policy. Of course the Americans were for America First. But thereafter, when we've been seduced into the fantasy of the persiflage that's been put around the operation of the global order subsequently, where we've thought that somehow it was being held up as if magically in the air, the multilateral system, it was deeply founded on power. Who really thinks that FDR pursued anything other than an America First policy, including hesitating going into the Second World War until he calculated that he could bring his public along with him, and he had a chance to develop the industrial power that was necessary, that in the end won that war, to both shore up Britain and the Soviet Union. Lend-Lease was nothing to do with mateship with Churchill. You look at the terms of Lend-Lease, it had America First all over it. Truman seriously contemplated withdrawing most other than a skeletal force from Europe in 1946. He was deeply concerned about bringing the American public with him in terms of remaining invested with troops in Western Europe. And it wasn't really until Stalin showed his hand in places like Greece and Turkey, revolutionary subversion in Italy, that Truman came around to the view that he needed to shore up Europe, reconstruct it, for commercial reasons, if nothing else, because that would create markets for American products, but really to forestall Soviet expansion. He didn't really come to that view until about 1947. What do we think happened for the 2 years between Victory in Europe Day, the defeat of Japan, and the pronouncement of the Truman Doctrine? There was a very serious contemplation about America going home. JFK, the space program was America First. It was about getting strategic technology that ultimately was paired with their classified programs. He wanted dominance in space, not for all mankind. We just lull ourselves into the fantasy that the space program is being run for the benefit of humanity. The Americans ran it for the benefit of themselves, as indeed did the Soviets. Reagan taking on the Soviet Union was not some historical crusade on behalf of humankind to defeat communism. It was to prevail over the Soviet Union and achieve an ascendancy over the Soviets with the application of American power that Reagan thought had been allowed to wilt under Nixon, with whom he disagreed, and Carter. America First is deeply embedded in US strategic culture. And guess what? Would you expect anything else? Who would they put first? It's ridiculous to think otherwise. Isolationism, America alone, is very different. I would contend, for the purposes of setting up the discussion here, that any suggestion that America withdraw to a hemispheric citadel protected by oceans, its massive array of nuclear weapons, and basically running an economy based on the domestic market, the last time that was seriously put forward in American politics was when Senator Robert Taft, another senator from Ohio, came very close to winning the nomination of for the Republican Party in 1952. The only reason why Eisenhower was convinced by other Republicans to run was to thwart Robert Taft. Taft was opposed to NATO, voted against it when it went through the Senate, and was determined to overturn what Truman had set up in terms of America's presence in Europe. What changed thereafter, and this is why America can never really become truly isolationist, is that in the 1950s, the consumerist revolution, American capitalism, expanded right throughout the world. American consumer products, American capital subsumed the world. And thereafter, American engagement became, in its most basic interest, an extension of its economic power. America is always seen itself as being the leading nation in a community of sovereign nations. And if you go back and read Trump's speeches to the UN General Assembly during his first term, there's nothing actually exceptional in what he was saying about sovereign nations coming together. He was caustic, of course, about the UN, what he considered to be the inert and what he called corrupted system of international bureaucracy. But at its heart, we all operate like that. No one waits for Guterres to tell us what to do. It's sovereign nations coming together and forming alliances and coalitions. Because if we actually had a world parliament in New York, that's where the Ukraine situation would be resolved. And that's where Guterres, on behalf of the world's parliament, would be brokering peace. He doesn't. I don't know what he does. He just goes around the world not doing what's in the Charter. Because what's in the Charter doesn't actually reflect how the world works. I know I'm putting my head into the lion's den in saying that here, but it's the truth. Finally, and I'm going to conclude on this point because I suspect we're going to be teasing this out. If it's a question of brutal power relativities, as a classical realist would understand the term, I will contend, and Hugh hopefully will disagree with me so we can have...
You can rely on me.
Good, excellent. That over the course of the next 4 years, and I'm just going to project this out to 2028 so that we've got a bounded temporal period, America will remain the most powerful nation on earth. In fact, if anything, Chinese power will start to plateau. It's already starting to fragment because of their demographic time bomb and Xi's attempt to strangle Chinese capitalism. The person who's going to be the Mikhail Gorbachev of China is likely to be Xi Jinping by crashing the innovation and entrepreneurship that would otherwise unleash a dramatically different China. So American power, not unipower, it's not a unipolar system of power, but American power relative to all other individual actors will be the most powerful on earth. How Trump exercises that power, wields it, is I think what we need to think about and talk about. Thank you very much.
Okay. An hour of truth bombs guaranteed, I think. So for the final opening comments, Professor Hugh White from the Australian National University.
Thanks, Latika. Great pleasure to be here and to join old friend and colleagues on this panel. Look, there are two views of what Trump means for those, many of us, who see the US as indispensable to global order and to Australia's place in it. There's fear and hope. There's fear that he will be isolationist and will withdraw from America's long-standing role as the arbiter of global order. And there's hope amongst some that in fact the opposite will happen, and that we'll see with Trump is a kind of a revival of what you might call a Reaganite peace through strength approach to America's role in international affairs. My take is neither of the above. Despite the talk of Trump's election being a fundamental shift in everything that's going on, I don't think the election changes anything very substantial in the fundamentals. That is, it doesn't change our expectations about whether the United States will play a decisive role in Asia, or for that matter globally, or my expectation as to whether or not, for Australia, supporting the United States in playing its role in Asia is the key to securing our future in this part of the world. I don't think America is going to make it work, and I don't think it would have made it work under Biden, and I don't think it's going to make it work under Trump. The reason for that is that because while both Republicans and Democrats talk a lot about resisting China's challenge and preserving US leadership in Asia and globally, neither do enough to meet, I'll speak just in terms of Asia at this stage, to meet China's challenge in Asia as it exists at the moment, or to deter China from pushing further. And that is for a very deep reason. That is that the imperatives for the United States to remain engaged in Asia as the leading or a leading power are not strong enough to outweigh the costs and risks to the United States of doing so in the face of China's determination to see it leave the region. The reason why the imperatives are not great enough is that China, even at its most, even on the most bullish assumptions, is not going to threaten the United States at home in the US homeland the way the Soviet Union potentially could have during the Cold War. It's not going to dominate Eurasia. is not even going to dominate Asia, even if America leaves, if only because India's going to be there. So it is not going to pose the kind of existential threat to the United States which mobilised and incentivised, compelled the United States to undertake the extraordinary effort and bear the extraordinary costs and risks that it bore during the last Cold War. The cost and risk that America would have to bear in order to do the same thing vis-a-vis China today are very great. It is going to have to spend a lot more on its military than it's spending at the moment. And it's going to have to face up to the reality that any conflict with China is likely to be a nuclear conflict, and it's going to have to confront the implications of that for the consequences to America of confronting China in East Asia. And particularly post-Ukraine, where nuclear weapons have played such a prominent part and the threat of nuclear war has loomed so large, I think that's something that the United States is going to be very reluctant to do. Now, the Biden administration never acknowledged the disconnect between the costs and risks to America of confronting China and the imperatives to do so, and the result was a policy with a deep disconnect between the rhetoric they used and the action they actually undertook. The historians looking back at the Biden administration and asking what did they actually do to confront and deter China will mention the Quad and AUKUS. It's not there. And I think the Trump administration will be very similar. Now, that doesn't mean there'll be no difference. The first point to make, of course, is there's a great deal we don't know about what a second Trump administration will be like. One thing we shouldn't do is to presume that it's going to be a lot like the first Trump administration. There are a lot of differences in the situation, including the scale of its victory, as Pete outlined it. But there is a couple of things we do know. One is that there's going to be a deep tension, probably going to be a deep tension, between Trump's officials and Trump himself, because the sorts of people who appear to be lining up to serve in senior places in his administration are tougher than the Democrats have been, more hawkish, more inclined to focus on a military build-up, more inclined to build, even than the Biden administration, to build up America's nuclear capabilities. Their messaging on Taiwan is going to be more provocative, and they're going to be tougher on allies. They're going to demand more of allies. Now, some might say that sounds like they're going to be better, that they will in fact be prepared to do the sorts of things that the Biden administration hasn't done to adequately push back against China and strengthen deterrence. I don't think that's true. I don't see any sign that anybody in the penumbra are serious about spending the kinds of money and making the kinds of commitments that would be required to effectively respond to the scale of China's challenge. But in the process of talking the way I've just sketched, they are going to be more provocative, and they're going to give Xi Jinping more reason to think that he'd be better off pulling a confrontation on. And that brings me to the other side of the coin, and that is that Trump himself is different. Trump is clearly, always has been, very focused on China as an economic rival. But there is very little evidence that Trump himself really cares very much about preserving US leadership in Asia or globally. That's not where he comes from. And as a corollary of that, he's not particularly interested in allies. So I think there's going to be a sort of an underlying tension between senior officials who are hawkish and Trump, who is, I think, genuinely isolationist. I think Trump's model of the world is actually the one that Mike sketched with Taft. And I'm less confident than he is that it won't come about. Now, that in some ways is a good thing, because that does mean that if or when at 3 o'clock in the morning the call comes through and everyone gathers in the Situation Room, Trump is less likely than Biden would have been, or arguably than Harris would have been, to heed the call of the people on that side of the table, the ones who say you have no choice but to defend Taiwan, and more likely to heed the call of the people on the other side of the table who says, actually, we're not going to win this war, and the stakes are not worth a nuclear war in which US cities might be attacked. So that's good news. Maybe Trump will be less likely to take America to war. On the other hand, although I don't think Trump would go to war with China in order to defend US leadership in Asia, he might go to war with China in order to stroke his own ego, and that's a factor. It's sort of like the baseball analogy, I think. So, what does this mean for Australia? 2 points. The first is, I think the Trump administration will sharpen the dilemma which is at the heart of Australia's policy at the moment. Our objective is to support the United States as much as we can to deter China, or at the same time not doing anything that irritates China enough to damage our trade relationships. Now, striking that balance has been the achievement so far of the Albanese government. But as the Trump administration expects more of us, demands more of us, demands our support for the US position to be even more explicit than it is already, and there's a lot they can ask for, don't imagine that we've done everything they might like, then we're going to find it harder and harder to keep Washington happy without really irritating Beijing. And that's a very serious issue for Australia. And the basic problem remains. That is that we are sitting in the middle of the biggest shift in Australia's international setting since European settlement, with the rise of China and India and Indonesia. We are living in a region of Asian great powers for the first time since the white guys arrived here. And that's something we really have to wake up to. The fact is that Asia's future is not going to be decided in Washington, no matter who's the president. It's going to be decided in Asia, and that's where we have to do our work. Thank you.
Okay, let's pick up on two things raised in those points. Let's go back to Professor Peter Dean's analogy on the baseball and this idea that only 1/3 of MAGA is really what Trump is about. Isn't the end result we get MAGA? We get dark MAGA in Elon Musk. And if that's the case, as Professor Hugh White says, why on earth would Australians want to get involved with that?
Look, I think it's important to remember that the US political system is a diverse system. So President Trump is not the US government, and he doesn't have unfettered control. The president has more powers in foreign policy and defence policy than he actually does in domestic policy. But as I said,
But
Congress...
this president is going to have control of all four institutions. That is fairly unprecedented.
Absolutely, but as I was saying before, I think the Senate Republicans, and you look at, say, Roger Wicker, who is the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee for the Republicans and will become the chairman. He is much more a traditional Republican in the Reagan sense than he is in the MAGA sense. Mike Rogers, who's the House Armed Services Committee chair, is very much in the same bat. So, as I said, the dynamics is that, and there's a lot of tensions, I think, inside the United States. So Trump wants 60% to 100% tariffs on China and 20% tariffs on everybody else. But he was elected on bringing inflation down, and tariffs are inherently inflationary. So he's going to have to square that circle. He's lowering taxes and in corporate and individual taxes, but that's going to blow the deficit out. So what impact is that going to have on potential defence spending? So there's a huge amount of tension and difference. It's a very fragile coalition he's got. And he's a lame duck president. Within 2 years, I can almost guarantee, I can't guarantee anything, but the history will suggest that the Democrats will control the House quite strongly. That is what happens in midterm elections. And within 2 years, you watch the Republican potential candidates for president start lining up, one way or the other, getting Trump support or distancing himself from Trump, and the Democrats doing it'll be a wide open field. So there's a lot of tensions at play, which will both constrain the president's ability to do things. And I'll give one foreign policy example. He wanted to pull US troops out of Korea. So what did the Congress do? A Republican-controlled Congress at that time, it passed a rider in the NDAA, the National Defence Authorization Act, saying there is no funds for the Trump administration to withdraw any troops from the Korean Peninsula. So the president could have announced it, and he would literally have had zero money in the budget to actually do it. He couldn't have moved one troop, one soldier, sailor, airman, marine or whatever, or one piece of equipment off that peninsula. So it'll be interesting to watch Congress, how it responds, and particularly the Senate, both the Senate and the House, of what restrictions they will put on Trump, where they'll also push Trump and his administration to do more. Roger Wicker, as I mentioned, was the guy who got $3.3 billion extra this year in the NDAA for the submarine industrial base. he will come out hard demanding the Trump administration spend a lot more on defence, and other Republicans will come out hard to cut the deficit and the spending, a la Dark Elon, and he's supposing $2 trillion he's going to find, which is more than the US government itself, but the $2 trillion he supposedly is going to find to cut from spending. So it's the tensions we've got to watch.
Mike Pezzullo, you were in advising governments at the time Trump was last in the White House. As Hugh White says, we have a different, perhaps, style of Trump. We also have a different government in Australia. What is your advice on how we should be approaching this Trump 2.0? And this morning we heard from Simon Birmingham saying that first coalition government actually had a lot of influence over the Trump administration. Do you think we're capable of exerting a similar level of influence again?
Well, I certainly think we're capable, and I think Senator Birmingham was right, and certainly was my observation sitting one level below where he was and dealing with sub-cabinet officials. I slightly disagree with Hugh on that point. I think Trump's instincts have not much changed, and so whilst he might be more resolute on certain domestic policy revolutions that I think he does want to achieve to embed on some culture war issues, I think we saw his instincts play out globally in a way that I think we'll see again. Now, he might be more resolute to override advisors. He won't have people like John Kelly there and Jim Mattis, etc. He's clearly not going to have Pompeo there, and he might try again, for instance, to follow through with withdrawal from South Korea, although I doubt it. And I doubt it for this reason. It goes back to, this is the difference, I think, between the analysis that I've provided and where Hugh got to. I actually don't think Trump is an isolationist in the way that you could have been an isolationist in the mid-20th century, where American capital was not dispersed around the world. America had a huge domestic economy, and all of its wealth from after the Civil War to about the 1950s was generated from domestic consumption and infrastructure investment in America. What happened after the 1950s, and this is about the only time you'll ever hear me agree with a Marxist economist, is that the structure of American power and its economy changed dramatically. Not so much in terms of its own trade exposure, although it did flood the world with consumer goods, white goods and all the rest of it, but its capital went all over the world. Trump understands the importance of American capital and the return on American capital intuitively. I'll give you one quick example, because I did serve in Home Affairs, which had responsibility for telecommunications security. Turnbull touches on this in his memoir, and he says in a couple of paragraphs, so it gives me cover to not spill secrets that I'm not meant to. He and Trump had extended conversations about 5G. Trump hadn't thought a lot about telecommunications. He was a property guy, he had other interests. As he dived more and more into what Malcolm and others were telling him about 5G, he was astonished that Motorola, Cisco and others had gotten out of a lot of the hardware manufacturing that is essential to the rollout of 5G. When he asked which American companies can stand in lieu of Huawei and ZTE, none, Mr. President. Well, who can? Well, there's Nokia, who owns them? Ericsson, who owns them? Samsung, he knew. He immediately was going for a calculation about how do I ensure, and he thought of it in these terms, friendly providers, not just American. He was upset and disappointed that no American companies could step into the breach, but he was okay with Sweden, Finland and Korea. I think Trump will double down on that instinct, and I'll finish on this point. He'll flip the traditional paradigm of trade following the flag, and this is where Hugh and I strongly disagree. For him, the flag will follow trade. And that's why I think a China that dominates economically from Taiwan, if they subsume it and annex it, right through to Portugal, will be an absolute anathema to him, not because he wants to lead the world in some abstract foreign policy sense, but they will crowd American capital and the American economy out. They won't want to sit in a citadel in the hemisphere in the way that Robert A. Taft would have in the 1950s, because that's now an impossible dream.
Melissa, if the trajectory is, as Mike Pezzullo outlines, isn't it worth staying the course with the Trump administration?
I'm not saying we shouldn't talk to the Trump administration. I'm saying, and I think Hugh put it very well, that if we believe that Asia's future is going to be decided in Asia, that's where we put our primary focus. And I would say that's not just a message for people who work in foreign policy. I mean, obviously people who work in foreign policy are going to have to deal with all of the governments of the world and all of our national interests. That's what we expect. I'm also thinking of the rest of us and a whole-of-nation approach to international policy. So do we think enough about Asia and our future in Asia if you're talking business and investment, if you're talking science and technology, if you're talking academia and state and territory governments and civil society and media and the arts? Do they get the attention that we often bestow on the US? And where would that attention get us the most return as a country? So it's a slightly different way of seeing it. Not that the US isn't there, it is there. We will indeed deal with it, but where is the focus? Where can we have the biggest effect on Australia's national interests? And if we all agree that the US under Trump is perhaps less influenceable in many ways, why don't we put our efforts in places where we can have and build influence?
Hugh White, you mentioned AUKUS and the Quad. Firstly, there's this constant speculation about how Trump would deal with AUKUS. I think it's pretty now assumed that he would be okay with it. Is that your assessment? And in terms of these groupings, I mean, isn't that actually a US-led way of forming our own way in Asia? We have the Quad, we've got the trilateral between Korea, Japan, the USA, which the USA has brokered, and we do now have AUKUS, a new partnership. Aren't these actual examples of American-led partnerships that are worth our national interest as well?
Well, just to take the second point first, Latika, yes, they are example of US-led partnerships, but I think they demonstrate the inadequacy of those partnerships to achieve genuine deterrent results. I mean,
so you don't think AUKUS will deter?
No, I don't, for a couple of reasons. The first is, I think the Trump administration is more likely to be sceptical about AUKUS than the Biden administration for two reasons. The first is they're more sceptical about allies, and the secondly is because it was a Biden administration initiative. And that, going on Trump's record, is not a bad reason to oppose it. But more fundamentally...
But we have proof of congressional support on that. And that includes MAGA Republicans, that includes Republicans, general Republicans.
Yes, on the assumption that supplying Virginia-class submarines to Australia does not detract from America's strategic interests. That depends on America being able to increase its rate of production from 1.3 to 2.3 a year. If that happens, then the United States will still face the choice, do we sacrifice American capability to increase Australian capability? Under the Biden administration, that seemed like a good idea. From my reading of Trump, and for that matter, from my reading of many of Trump's people, that looks like a bad bet from America's point of view, even if they do increase the submarine production rate, which I think is itself highly unlikely. So I'm very sceptical that AUKUS will deliver any nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. The Trump's election only marginally increases my scepticism, but it does increase it a little bit.
Okay, Peter Dean, a bad bet?
Look, I think there's far more in favour of the Trump administration supporting AUKUS than not. On Hugh's point, Marco Rubio has gone on the public record, Roger Wicker has gone on the public record, and for those you know Marco Rubio at the moment, he's one of the people touted as a very strong contender for Secretary of State. He has publicly said that even if they don't get to that level of submarine building, it's still in American strategic interest to sell those submarines to Australia. As I said, Roger Wicker is the person who got $3.3 billion extra in the submarine industrial base this year. I actually think under this administration there is much stronger potential for increased investment into that submarine industrial base given the alignment in the House and Congress and Trump's previous plans about increasing the Navy. I think that's more likely than not. And I think there's a flip side to the AUKUS deal that most people aren't paying attention to. And I said this to the I would say, astonishment, if not horror, of some NATO ambassadors that I met with the other week. This is a good deal for the United States of America. Australia is paying for the costs. We're not loaning submarines, we're not leasing submarines, we're not borrowing submarines, we're paying for them. The US Congress changed the law to allow Australia to give the US money to invest in the submarine industrial base to get that extra submarine out of the back end of the line. What if Trump looks at this and his people and then turns around to all other US allies and says, well, if Australia can do this, why can't you? And if they're and so like it actually figures out and plays well. There is a high likelihood that Trump will like this deal because it's the type of deal he wants other US allies to do and pay up for. And in the end, this is about Australia getting a sovereign capability. The US is requiring us to have a sovereign capability to sustain, maintain, operate and dispose of these submarines. They are not giving it to us for free. And most importantly though, President Trump will not make the decision. It is under legislation in Congress, it is the president after Donald Trump who will actually make the decision whether or not they sell those Virginia-class submarines to us. He could change the deal. Like I'm a believer in the John Bolton principle, right? Which I've never quoted John Bolton in my life and I don't think I've ever agreed with him. But about 9 months ago he wrote a piece that said anyone who thinks they know what Donald Trump's going to do is not telling you the truth because Donald Trump doesn't know what he's going to do. So there's always an asterisk and caveat right at the top of everything of this. But it's a good deal that the United States have negotiated, and I think there's more in it for the MAGA Republicans to say, this is the type of deal that we could do. And if I can have one little point extra, to go to Mike's point, JD Vance has been very sceptical in Ukraine. Why? Because he said that we need to move US resources back into Asia to take on China and that. If you go back and look at that far-right part of the Republican Party in America, into that period that Mike was talking about, or even earlier, they've been fundamentally anti-European and anti-Europe, and fundamentally Asia first. Yep. And Vance inherits that tradition, as do a lot of the MAGA people inside the Republican Party. They are less isolationist than they are anti-European, and they are fundamentally like the Republican isolationists in the late 1930s. They were all about taking China on in Asia first and investing in that. The same senator from Ohio in the 1930s said exactly that, very much the same way the senator, or now Vice President-elect from Ohio is saying today. You can draw a straight line between their ideological beliefs.
There's a strand running through all your contributions, which is this unpredictability of Donald Trump. And everyone talks about it as though it's a great virtue about what it could do geopolitically. But what about if you're an ally, if you're Australian, you're sitting there and you see your best mate suddenly throwing the unpredictability, I think you used the baseball analogy, Peter, that the pitching at you, how is that a fair deal? And Mike Pezzullo, don't you think that it's fairly valid then to question where public opinion in Australia would be if we're having to deal with an unreliable, unstable, unpredictable ally and suddenly they're on the phone, as Hugh White says, and says, hey, come and follow us into a conflict in Taiwan?
Well, I guess circling back to what I said, Latika, I know the headline about unpredictability both gets a good laugh and then there's elements of truth to it. I just don't think it's the case.
But it is. We're having a conversation here about whether Donald Trump would support AUKUS, this massive giant capability that we're expending so much funds on.
We're having a conversation because we don't get to talk to him or we don't get to talk to the people close to him. But there are connections and, if you like, relationships of influence that actually should give us cause to think that there's not many options on the table in any event. I mean, he either rips up the agreement, which I just don't think he will for the reasons that Peter's touched on. I'm slightly closer to Hugh in terms of my concern about the next president, because it won't be President Trump, it'll be President Vance or President Shapiro or whomever might be in the White House in the next term, who on the advice of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Joint Chiefs say, that boat that's coming along the production line that was meant to go to Australia in 32, we need to keep that one. Now, this is where I agree with Hugh's scepticism, but I probably disagree with the portent of that. If they're keeping that boat, it's probably to do with a problem that we also would have to deal with anyway. In other words, if they're keeping that boat, it's because there's a serious prospect. There's a serious prospect of either undersea warfare in the Western Pacific or undersea warfare against the Russian Navy in the North Atlantic. So in those circumstances, it's not just simply a question of saying, gosh, our mate's let us down because he promised us that boat. We might well want them to win that war, I would have thought, if it comes about. And so we might make alternative contributions. Now, I'd prefer to have a sovereign submarine capability any day of the week, but if it's the choice of the Americans not having their 48th or 49th or 50th boat because they're fighting a real war, either in the Western Pacific or the North Atlantic, or both at the same time, we've probably got a vested interest in supporting them to win that war anyway. So I'm not so catastrophised about that uncertainty. So again, you can reason with someone who you're going to know his instincts. It's going to be about transactions. It's going to be about business relationships. And I agree with Peter. He'll look at the AUKUS deal and actually probably weaponise it with a whole lot of other allies and partners and say, actually, the Aussies are doing great work with us rebuilding our own submarine industrial base for their own reasons, but America gets a good deal out of it. I want you to do the same thing. France or Britain or Sweden or Norway.
That might turn some of our other partners against us, Mike. We're going to turn to some questions from the floor. Does anyone have some? If you do, please come and start lining up at the microphones. Melissa, I might actually invite you back into that conversation if you have any comments there about whether it would be seen favourably in that light.
I think we're talking about Trump's unpredictability.
Yes.
So I talked about it as capricious, meretricious. Yeah, I think there's some unpredictability there. I actually, for what it's worth, I agree with the idea that AUKUS has been very well designed to try to be Trump-proof, and it has been made in that way. But whether it all happens or not, who knows? I do still put that there. And that makes me think about a future where our fortunes are not tied so closely to a capricious US.
But to who?
A strange one.
Who instead?
Well, no, I'll put it. I don't think it's one, and I think this session has been called Great and Powerful. And I think it's a core problem with Australia, is that we want to find one great and powerful friend. That's hardwired. I understand why it's hardwired in our history, but it's not the only option. You can work with a lot of other countries to try to create an area you want. And I suppose I was just going to put another way of thinking about it. I mean, I think to myself, it would be quicker to have all school children in Australia learn Indonesian than getting AUKUS submarines, okay? So there are other things we can do, and we focus so much of our attention on the US, and particularly at the moment, on AUKUS, as if that's the one thing that is going to secure our future, and I don't believe it is.
Why is AUKUS the one thing that will secure our future? Peter or Mike?
Look, it's not the one thing that's going to secure our future. In fact, I don't even think it's the most important defence thing that's going to secure our future.
Correct.
About a fortnight ago, Defence Capability Industry Minister Pat Connery launched the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Plan. If that plan doesn't work, then the whole DSR NDS strategy falls apart. It could live without AUKUS. It would be a big hole in it, but it could live without it. So it's not the be-all and end-all of sort of defence capability. But to Melissa's point, I'll just say, learning Indonesian would be great. More people should be doing it, absolutely. But Indonesia can't deliver us hard military power. It can't sell us long-range missiles. It can't provide deterrence effects, and it's fundamentally consumed by its own internal security issues, as is a lot of the other states in the region. So our need to engage with the United States is to achieve things for our own sovereign defence relationship, but also to help provide that regional strategic balance with the US as a core balancing partner of that coalition. And this is where, for instance, I disagree with Hugh. America won't leave the region for all the reasons Mike said, but also because it's in the region. It's part of the Indo-Pacific. It's a Pacific power. It always has been a Pacific power, and geography means that it always will be a Pacific power.
Do we have any questions? Yes, we have one at the microphone here.
Hi, I think we'd all like to hear what your opinions on how Trump will deal with Ukraine and Russia.
Great question. We haven't asked that one yet. Hugh White, would you like to begin?
Look, I mean, on that, I think in a sense really is unpredictable, because we've all heard what he said so far, but we haven't seen him instrumentalise that yet. But I would just make this point, that the Western response to Ukraine has presupposed that with moderate Western support and with no real strategic risk to the West, Ukraine could achieve a military outcome on the battlefront which would deprive Putin of anything that looks remotely like a victory. And it's now clear that that's not the case. Yep. I think it's now widely accepted that that there's going to have to be a deal, which leaves a lot of Ukraine, something like the present 20%, in Russian hands. So I think actually Trump's threat promise to end the war in 24 hours looked radical when he started making it. It now looks much closer to being orthodoxy. And I think although the timing, there's a sort of an element of theatricality about the timing, I don't think he'll do it that quickly. But I think whatever happens, I think Ukraine's destiny is to do a deal with Russia, which is going to be very difficult to live with. That does have big implications for the way in which Europeans see their security and the extent to which they believe they can rely on the United States under any kind of administration. Again, I don't think Trump makes a huge difference to this. Credibility of the United States as the key strategic guarantor of the European international order has, I think, received a very serious blow with Ukraine, and that would be true whoever had won last Tuesday.
Mike Pezzullo, do you agree that that would be an incentive perhaps maybe in our region if the Europeans see that the Americans cannot stand by the credibility they guarantee?
To an extent, if it plays out in the way that Hugh's describing, I think that's a very plausible scenario. I think the orthodoxy of ending the war in 24 hours, to paraphrase you, Hugh, I think Trump will take a win out of a ceasefire or some form of armistice, without saying that this is now the permanent resolution of territorial boundaries, etc. And that actually creates an opening to actually start thinking through what are the possibilities, including potentially flipping Russia, because I think the other thing that he's interested in is actually lifting sanctions and trying to work out a way to, if you like, normalise, not for any reasons to do with Russian interference or somehow he's in hock to the Russians. I think that's been looked at so closely. There's clearly very little, if any, evidence of that.
So you mean the environment and bringing Russia back into the
I mean,
table.
Using Russia as a counterbalance to China.
Yes. So you do a reverse Nixon.
Yeah, that's right.
And this is what Kissinger was talking about towards the end of his life. You apply the same sort of logic where they flipped China. You could potentially flip Russia, potentially. If that's on the table, the oligarchs would have to be protected, and Putin's personal wealth, obviously, he won't part with that anytime soon. But if that was also on the table, then it might be that some just peace, because you don't want to reward naked aggression just simply through capitulation, along with the Europeans being more serious, like fundamentally serious about protecting their own eastern flank, probably without Ukraine in NATO, but potentially in the EU, for instance. I think Trump's unpredictability, which I just think is his negotiating approach. Like, there's not an infinite range of possibilities that he can apply. There's a narrow range, and then the unpredictability relates to which combination of options he might play in order to get the transaction done. I think there's more creative options potentially available now that Trump's going to go back into the White House than was previously the case.
Really interesting. We have a question over here from the lady.
My question relates to the UN and what Trump will do in the UN sphere. We saw in his first administration, he pulled the US out of the Human Rights Council, he pulled the US out of UNESCO, and then ultimately at the height of the pandemic, he pulled the US out of WHO. So the question will be, we've got a pact for the future, we've got UN reforms on the table with the Secretary General. Where would he take us in that sphere? And perhaps also if there's space to ask, what would he do on Palestine? Because that should have been linked in a way to what he would have done in Ukraine. Will it be very different? Thank you.
Okay, Melissa?
I'll come in on that because I had the same reaction that if we're talking about just peace, we also have to be talking about Gaza and Israel. I am very concerned that a Trump administration might give essentially a bit of a free pass to Israel on how it conducts itself, and I don't think that's good for either Israel or for Palestinians. In both those conflicts, in Ukraine and Gaza, we care deeply about issues like compliance with international humanitarian law, protection of civilians, and it becomes quite difficult when you've got a US which I think is going to be dismissive of some of those rules, not see them as particularly relevant. On the UN, I think all the things you mentioned could very well happen again. The one I'm most concerned about is the US no longer paying its dues to the UN. If it decides to go that far, then you're in a situation where the UN is very much hamstrung and incapacitated in how it can respond.
Peter, I think I can see you.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think if you go and look at Trump's speeches at the UN from last time around, you're pretty much going to get and his behaviour is what you're going to get this time around. On what's happening in the Middle East, I firmly think if you look at the Trump view of the Middle East and the people around him, this is all about Iran to them. And we know Iran is backing and pulling the strings with Hezbollah and Hamas. They don't see it so much in the confines of the Israel-Palestinian state question about the bid by Iran for regional dominance influence. Interestingly, if you go and look at the last Trump regime, he was the one that helped broker deals between Iran and a lot of other Middle Eastern states who were opposed to Iran, so Egypt and Saudi Arabia and others. Now, that's much more difficult now, but I think his gut inclination is to go back there. On one level, it'll be a bit unfettered with Israel, but on another, I think he'll want to put a handbrake on some of the extremes of Netanyahu because he wants to build that broader anti-Iranian coalition, and that falls apart if you're 100% in with Netanyahu and not bringing in these other states. So I think they look at it through a very different power politics lens. And just on Ukraine very quickly, I'd say I agree with Hugh's assessment 100%. We're in a position where the US and the rest of the world, and particularly the Europeans, have put Ukraine in a position where they're denying Russian victory and not providing a pathway for the Ukrainians to get a political outcome. So war is politics by other means, as Carl von Clausewitz told us. There has to be a political solution at one stage. Trump is definitely not going to get it overnight. And we've got to remember also that the majority of Republicans in the House and the Senate actually support Ukraine. The MAGA response is the minority Republican viewpoint within the party. He's going to have to broker that position as well. But Ukraine had to end with a political solution somehow. In fact, in some senses, this could force that bargaining position. That just the risk is, what is Trump willing to give up? And the other question for the Europeans is, what are they willing to stand up for? Because remember, Trump's big issue is the Europeans not paying their way and not being responsible for their own security. And we've got to keep in mind, Ukraine is not NATO. It is not a member of NATO. Article 5 does not apply. But just as much, Trump could turn around to Putin and say, okay, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to give Ukraine NATO membership.
Yeah.
Right? So there's plenty of bargaining chips in each way that he can go, but he wants a deal and he'll want to deliver on that. The question is, what is he willing to press and what is he willing to demand, particularly from the Ukrainians around this, and what are the Europeans willing to go, actually, no, we're not happy with that, but then willing to support Ukraine with money or arms or equipment or their own security to offset that? It's going to be a big question.
Mike Pezzullo, you wanted to come in on Palestine. Do you agree with Peter Dean here as it's broadly about anti-Iran?
Most definitely, and again, more in terms of continuity with the first administration, or the first term rather than discontinuity. He got very close with Saudi Arabia. One of the stellar achievements of the Trump administration, but they left their run too late. And when you're
talking about the Abraham Accords here? Yes.
Yeah, with Morocco, Bahrain and the Emirates. A stellar, just that alone, if that had been a Democrat president, there'd be noise throughout the Twitter sphere about a Nobel Peace Prize. But because it was Donald Trump, no one in this room would have tweeted that, I'm sure. If he can go back to where he left off, and you read Bolton's account and McMaster's account about the amount of work they were doing with MSB, now the murder of Khashoggi, of course, got in the way. Biden foolishly made that his number one issue with Saudi Arabia, and they, of course, backed off and started talking to the Chinese. If Trump can get back to where he was before that...
But are you saying we should have overlooked Khashoggi?
No, of course not. No, of course not. Just don't do it again. So that's about American power being a good thing, not something to be embarrassed about, saying you will not go around killing journalists. And having a tough American president who's unashamedly and unembarrassingly wielding power like that is actually a good thing if it's applied in that way. Like, why would we want someone to be feckless and weak in the White House with all that power and authority and not say to Saudi Arabia, don't go around killing journalists? Now, where I think you want to go is to flip Saudi Arabia back away from the dalliance that it's been playing with China in recent years, completely isolate Iran, with the promise being that you've got to do the treaty with Israel, recognise its existence, secure its borders, and then I want a lot of Saudi money and Emirati money to basically rebuild both Gaza and the West Bank. Everyone gets a house, all the municipal services, all the essential infrastructure is all rebuilt, and there will be peace in the Middle East.
And what's the check and balance on Netanyahu in that scenario?
Now, on his right, and this is where Netanyahu has, that's where he's going to have his, I won't say come to Jesus moment, because that would not be appropriate in that circumstance. But he's I was thinking about saying that, I'm not going to say it. He will need to seriously think about whether he misses the opportunity to not miss an opportunity, the way Arafat used to do, and take on the zealots on his right to say this is actually the deal of a generation. In fact, it's a timeless deal, because if you've got a Palestinian state that's been reconstructed and its security is assured by the Arab coalition of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the Emirates and Jordan living in peace, where Israel is secure, there will be no more Middle East wars. And it is then about having a completely contained and isolated Iran.
Okay, I can see you've been waiting very patiently. By the way, if you have questions, please do come to the microphones. Yes, please go ahead. And also just do state where you're from.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Blows, and I'm an international relations student with the University of Queensland. And I've found myself nodding my head most often when Melissa speaks, so I guess my question is going to be aimed towards some of her talking points. Australia has long been a follower, first as a colony of the British Empire following the British, and more recently following the American political agenda. Given that the United States is becoming increasingly unreliable, especially when it changes a lot of their political stances in a lot of the multilateral engagement that they have generally, but also within our region, is it time that Australia step up into more of a leadership position within our region, providing more consistent and disciplined leadership with those countries?
Well, Melissa, he name-checked you, so I think we should start with you.
It's fine. Look, I agree with many of the things you said there. I'm not sure if I would say so much leadership position. I think Australia should be enmeshed, embedded in our region as a full part of our region. And maybe not saying we want to be a leader all the time might actually help with that. I agree with your historical analysis, and I think it made a lot of sense for Australia. I mean, we exist because we're the high watermark of British imperialism, as Richard Rigby would talk about it. We have always had great and powerful friends, and they've always been part of the way that we live in the world. We don't have a historical memory of a strong Asia. We don't know how to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons we just haven't made the adjustment as quickly as I think the geopolitics suggests we should, because for us that is new and difficult. Now, of course, for the people in the rest of the region, they've got much longer historical memories. If you're talking about how long has Vietnam coped with difficult China, well, that's a long time, you know. And so they, I think, are finding it easier to cope with the big changes that we're seeing. So to me, a lot of it is just a mindset shift. Often the things we're doing are probably the right sort of things, you know. The leadership, I would say, that you're seeing from, you know, the foreign minister talking about strategic equilibrium in our region, the messaging to the region, all of that is extremely positive and is very good. I often feel that the rest of the country has to catch up, as it were. That the people who deal with this day in, day out understand that living in a strong Asia is what we have to manage, but a lot of us, I think, are stuck in a different mindset.
Hugh White, are we followers first?
Look, I very much agree with the way Melissa put that. It's not an accident that Australia has always been dependent on a great and powerful English-speaking, and as it happens, predominantly white-skinned imperial power. It's an accident of history that ever since European settlement, either Britain or America has been the world's strongest economy, the world's predominant maritime power, and the strongest strategic power in East Asia. And so we think that's normal. But our Asian neighbours don't think it's normal, they think it's an interesting interlude. And the difference between my analysis and most others, I think, including my old mate here, is that I think that era has come to an end. And it's come to an end for a very simple reason, that China and India and Indonesia and others are having their industrial revolutions. The transformation of economic life that occurred in the late 18th and early 19th century, which put Britain and then America in the position to be the dominant power in this part of the world, has now spread to them. And so the great disequilibrium that occurred when some countries acquired the Industrial Revolution and other countries didn't has now been returned, and the world's biggest countries are now the strongest. Now, I don't think there was ever anything wrong with Australia relying on those great and powerful friends while they were around there. I think it was smart policy, and I spent quite a lot of my career working in that framework. But I think the challenge for us is to recognise that that historical moment has passed. That's why I said at the end of my remarks that we are living through the biggest transformation in Australia's international setting since European settlement.
What about Mike Pezzullo's earlier point, though, where China is going through its demographic time bomb? They're much likelier to get old before they get wealthy enough to sustain the industrialisation they're going through?
Oh, I don't think it's as that bad for China. I mean, it's all worth making the point that ever since Deng Xiaoping instituted his revolution in 1979, we in the West have consistently underestimated China every single time. Now, that's not to say that China doesn't have big problems, but it is to say it's a big mistake for us to base our policy on the expectation that the Chinese are going to solve our problem for us by screwing up. Whatever happens, I mean, even if...
we can help them.
Well, don't bet on it. I mean, even if China flatlines, even if it does over the next couple of decades what Japan has done since 1990, it will still have an economy which is way bigger relative to America's than the Soviet Union's ever was at its best, at its height, on its best day. It's therefore, I think, easily, has for a long time now been powerful enough to raise the costs and risks to America of confronting China's position and ambitions in East Asia to the point where it's not worth America's while. It's worth bearing in mind that the era, I mean, as Mike said, America has been a big power in the Western Pacific for a long time, but in those days, I mean, when Nixon did his deal with Mao in 1972, China's economy was 1/20th the size of America's. When Imperial Japan decided to take on America in 1941, its economy was probably about 1/8 the size of America's. Now America faces in Asia an economy in China which, even with its problems, on PPP terms, which is the one that matters more for strategists than market exchange rates, is bigger than America's.
Peter, I'm coming to you in a second, but I just want to finalise one more question to you, Hugh White. Do you agree with Mike Pezzullo's belief that Xi Jinping is the Gorbachev of China?
No. I mean, there's a very important difference between the China that governed by Xi Jinping and the Soviet Union governed by Gorbachev, and that is that although China has lots of problems, economic problems, its economy basically works, and the Soviet Union's economy basically didn't. And so, you know, that's a really massive change. I think the challenge here is to recognise that China has lots of problems, but it's worth bearing in mind. I mean, I'm not an economist and I don't regard myself as a China expert, but I've been following what people have been saying about China's economy for a long time now, and I've never known a moment where people didn't say, oh, China's got these terrible problems, it's all about to fall in a hole. Of course, it's never going to see 10% per annum real growth again. It may not even ever see 7% per annum real growth again. But an economy of that size, it doesn't have to. The question is it strong enough to impose costs on America, if America wants to oppose it, to the point where the United States can't hack it? And I think the point is we passed that point a long time ago.
Okay, really interesting. Peter, you wanted to come in there.
Look, I would actually say there's a bit of a false premise to your question there. So if you go back pre-federation, one of the reasons why did we federate? Because Australia searched for security in our region that was not necessarily aligned with Great Britain.
Yeah.
If you look at our experience in the 1920s around the Singapore strategy and the constant debates and arguments we had with the British, which led us to set up our first trade representatives overseas in the United States and our first defence representatives overseas because it didn't align with British interests. All the way through to, you know, the war-worn thing that, you know, we follow America into wars. Well, if you go off and have a look at the Vietnam War, we asked the Americans to ask the South Vietnamese to ask us to commit troops to Vietnam. Why? Because we had decided that we thought it was in our interest to entrap the United States into supporting security in Southeast Asia against communist aggression. You can agree or disagree with why we did those things. That's legitimate. But the governments at the time did it for Australian strategic interests, for Australian national interests. We're not following anyone. We just thought it was best for our security interests to align ourselves with those countries. But we constantly fought with them all the way through. If you go back and look at, Neville Meany's great work, which Hugh introduced me to many a year ago, about that search for security that starts way back in the 1880s and 1890s, it's a fascinating tale about us, identifying what our interests are and identifying where they differed from our strategic partners and how we could get them to do what we want them to do, or we accept some risk ourselves. So you can debate, the Iraq War. Howard, I firmly didn't necessarily believe in a democratic Iraq was the reason why. He wanted to get closer to the United States because I think he drew the wrong lessons from the experience in East Timor. Now, I think they're the wrong lessons to experience, but he did it out of what he believed was Australian strategic interests. So we should less hold our great and powerful friends account for what we do, and I think we need to hold ourselves account for what we do and our governments account for what we do, because in the end, in a democracy, we vote them in and we vote them out.
Okay, I'm coming to you over there, but Hugh White wants to add one more point.
I just wanted to say I absolutely agree with Pete's sort of catalogue then of occasions when Australia contested and really scrupulously scrutinised how well our great and powerful friends were doing, and that we didn't just blindly follow them. And for example, the people who made the moves towards federation because they recognised that the Pax Britannica, which had kept us safe through the 19th century, was coming apart because Britain's relative power was declining. The point I just make is that I don't think our generation is being as sophisticated in our analysis of the shift in the distribution of wealth and power and its strategic implications for Australia as our predecessors in the 1890s or the 1910s or the 1920s or the 1950s or the 1980s were. We need to do better.
Okay, you can go ahead and please ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for the talk. Today we talk too much stuff about China, and I'm exactly an overseas student from China doing my master's degree of international relations in ANU. I'm very interested in the topic about the involvement of Australia in the potential Taiwan conflict in the future, perhaps. So, I'm here to bring some, as Chinese, from my perspective, the limited military power of Australia. If one day the Taiwan conflict bursts, it will be a rivalry between the great power between US and China. And considering the limited military power of Australia, whether or not Australia participates in the Taiwan conflict cannot make significance. I'm not Australia, but I know you Australia guys have a national holiday called Anzac Day, right? To celebrate the casualty in the First World War. Australia sent its troops perhaps 10,000 miles away to Turkey. And 1,000 soldiers, they are brave soldiers, but...
Okay, can we get to the question? Is your question, what would Australia contribute to Taiwan?
Yeah, I'm pretty curious why Australia are so keen on sacrifice for their allies, even it can't make significance.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, Peter Dean, we were talking about this earlier. If there is any sort of contingency over Taiwan, what exactly does Australia have to contribute?
So, well, we have a lot to contribute diplomatically, internationally, and a whole range of things, but I think you're getting to sort of militarily. Look, there's only limited amounts, this will be fought out between the big great powers, and there would be limited amounts, but I could envisage a position of what America might ask us for help and support, right? So, overflight, basing, all of that type of stuff in the north of Australia is an obvious thing that they would ask for. We have a couple of key critical capabilities and a small number of them that I think the Americans would look for. We're the only country outside the United States to operate Growler electronic warfare aircraft, and we hold about 18 to 20% of the world's fleet in that, and they're absolutely critical in any conventional conflict. Our wedge-tail aircrafts are critical, and the Americans are buying it because they're the best of their type of the airborne early warning aircraft in the world. Maybe some special forces, a few other things sort of like that. And obviously, there may or may not be, depending on how many submariners we have and how the Collins-Clark fleet is going, there may or may not be a submarine to send somewhere. I think if it turns, I think the caveat though is really important, is that if there is a broad-scale conflict that starts over Taiwan and we get involved, the fundamental number one rationale of the Australian government will be the protection of the Australian continent and the Australian people and keeping the Australian economy going. That will be their overriding thing. So we will look east and west more than we will look north. We will look about protecting our sea lines of communication and our ability to trade and do other things through our Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean approaches, and it will be limited things that we could potentially, or the government would commit to, only if they can see it in the context of the security of Australia. And that's fundamentally what the government signed up to with the concept of national defence and the National Defence Strategy and the DSR. It's about the protection of Australia in our northern approaches, and that is overwhelmingly going to be the focus on that. And if I can just add one caveat, we have a fundamentally broken conversation in Australia around Taiwan. It's fundamentally broken because it always works on the edict of, would we fight a war with the United States for US primacy over Taiwan? I cannot believe that is the number one reason that a war would start over Taiwan. It is most likely that the Chinese make a decision to unilaterally use force to solve the Taiwan question. And there are so many vastly unknowns about what that war, like the Taiwan hypothetical, I'm sick to death of journalists asking it. And
Sorry.
The government, if you remember back a bit of history, if you remember when Alexander Downer fumbled the ball a little bit on this and then Dave Johnson did and stuff, and ever since then it's become a bit of an obsession, right? But also it requires the political class to not just say, I'm not going to do the Taiwan hypothetical question, but to reframe that conversation. And I have to say, it's like they don't want to reframe that question either, right? So it's not all the journalist's fault. They just want to avoid the question. So the security of Taiwan is an important regional security issue. I don't think as a responsible international citizen we can walk away from that. And if we do, that is trying to get security from Asia, not security in Asia. If we are a part of Asia, as Melissa says, if we're going to get more involved, we need to take a responsible, mature, acceptable response about how we engage with Taiwan. And that's constraining sometimes our ally when they go too far and making that clear, or making it clear that outright aggression and the use of military force is not acceptable either. And we need to have a much more mature, because it is the number one flashpoint in our region, and I think the number one thing that could cause a war, and we need a far more mature response than basic questions of, are we going to fight to support American primacy, or are we going to do this, that or the other?
Melissa.
I'm going to come in on that one. So I wanted to take the public opinion side. A couple of years ago, I was in Taiwan at their Ministry of Defence think tank as a fellow for a lot of the year. And we did research, and I hope you like the way we did the questions, because it was not about US primacy. We asked, we did public opinion polling in Australia and in Taiwan. And for the Australians, we asked them, would the Australian people be prepared to go to war to help Taiwanese people gain their independence? So that's assuming Taiwan is starting it. And then on the other side, if China incorporated Taiwan, should Australia send its defence forces? So I think that goes to the question we have of sort of how much Australia would sacrifice for Taiwan. And at least on the public opinion polling at that point, I would be somewhat concerned. So 20% were pro, 40% were against, and 40% were undecided. So those were the numbers we're looking at. Now, if it actually happens, if a contingency happens, then you'll have a whole nother set of questions about how people respond to it. But that's the start of it. I suppose I would be saying, and maybe again it's flipping the question, it's thinking about what tools can we use so this never happens. Yes? Because it would be a calamity.
I mean, that's what AUKUS is about.
That's a particular tool. I'm not sure.
It is a tool.
I'm
Too
not
late.
sure it has the deterrence value in the time frame that's actually going to have any impact on this. Actually, our more useful deterrence tools are trade ones, because if you look at the major reasons why China is not trying to resolve this question by force, it's mostly fears about what that would do to the most important factor for China, which is its long-term development. So yes, I'm just going to go there again saying it would be a calamity for Taiwan's people, it would be a calamity for the global economy. We should be using every tool we have, and most of those are non-defence tools, to try to make sure that it never happens.
Mm-hmm. Did you have a question? Yes, we'll finish, I think, with your final question from the floor over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Claudia and I'm a student at the University of Melbourne. My question is regarding Afghanistan, because I don't think we can talk about conflict and crisis without talking about what's happening in Afghanistan. And given that during the original Trump administration, he signed a deal removing US troops from Afghanistan, and since then humanitarian aid has significantly decreased and the crisis has increased, what do you see the Trump administration doing in regards to this crisis, as non-response would be in direct opposition to his comments regarding counterterrorism?
Yep, Peter Dean.
Look, I think the Trump administration at the moment only sees Afghanistan through one particular lens, and it's a way to bash up the Democratic Party about the failure of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the way and mechanism that happened. Trump was clearly not involved in the equities of Afghanistan, and while the United States continues to assess it low as a strategic risk, I just think the Trump administration will have little interest in getting involved, or probably little interest in even providing additional humanitarian support, unfortunately. And that's come back into the real power politics. The real power politics is US foreign policy interests under the Trump regime will be dominated by his Ukraine issue, the Middle East issue, China, and tariffs. And what does he do about tariffs? Tariffs will be the big thing. I mean, this is a man who said his favourite word in the dictionary is tariffs. Now, I've pivoted from Afghanistan to tariffs, but I'm just simply trying to say, in the list of 1,000 things that will be on the foreign policy agenda, or a couple of hundred things that will be on the foreign policy agenda, I think you'll find that at the very bottom, if it's on the list at all.
Okay, we're about to wrap up, and I want to finish with one quick fire question to the entire panel, yes or no. Australia's man in DC, who's going to have to deal with this Trump 2.0 administration, spent the first morning of Trump's re-election busily deleting all the tweets he'd written about Trump. Should he stay as our ambassador, yes or no, to the panel? Each of you.
No.
No view, but Australia should do more in Afghanistan.
Who Australia's ambassador is in Washington should only be a matter for the Australian government, and if it's the will of the Australian government to keep Dr. Rudd there, he should stay there.
Hugh White?
I don't think it'll make much difference.
And with that, thank you very much for attending this panel. Please thank our panel.
Well, thanks for listening. I mean, if you've made it this far, you obviously found it an enjoyable and engaging discussion, and I think you could hear from my moderation there that I really enjoyed it as well. I thought it was a top discussion. And what you didn't see was Hugh White and I arguing out nuclear deterrence using spoons at our dinner table that evening. Maybe we can replay it for you minus the spoons in another podcast episode sometime. Anyway, you've heard way too much from me today, so I'm going to shush now. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening. Please do rate and review this podcast because I'm super enjoying it. So it would be nice if you could help me get my ratings up because it all matters. Thanks a lot and see you soon.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.